All right, we're live. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Phys Ed Boxcast, the Global Phys Ed Boxcast. I'm really excited to be talking to Anne Van Dam today. I'm a really big fan of your work on agency, your work on play, and all the information and resources you have out there on the internet and in workshops and everything else. I'm a big fan of your work, so I'm excited to be talking to you. How are you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you. And thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on the podcast too, actually. It's always lovely, I think, to have that opportunity to talk about the things that you deeply care about. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I appreciate your time. I know you're very busy, and I appreciate you spending a little bit of time with us and our listeners. So I always like to start off with a little bit of background on our guests. So tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into education?
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time? How did you?
Yeah, how did you get into education?
How did I get into education? I guess it's a long story because I'm 52 now, right? So it goes way back when. But I did teacher's training, I guess. Yeah, when did I start teaching? In 91, I started teaching, and this was at a Dutch primary school. So this is a long time ago in a very different context that I'm used to right now, hey, with the consultancy work that I do with international schools. But yeah, I started teaching in 91, and I think as I was in teacher training, I was always really intrigued by the world of young children. And I still remember that day. I often talk about this, actually, that I walked into an early childhood classroom for the very first time, and I kind of looked around, and I kind of felt like I had arrived, if that makes sense, right? Not like that sense of, yeah, this is where I need to be. You know, I think that's what I'm trying to express. Hey, that sense of, yeah, this is a beautiful space, and this is so important what these children are doing there. This is what I need to do, and it was a beautiful feeling. Yeah, that sort of idea of, I found my purpose, I found my passion in life. So I've always worked with young children, you know, like a little bit of a step into grade 1, 2, and 3 for a while, but early childhood has always been my life. And then from there, stepped into the School of International Teaching as I moved abroad, China, Singapore, Switzerland, and now back in the Netherlands. So we moved back in 2015 after 16 years, and that's where I started working for the IB as a consultant, you know, working on the IB PYP review. And consultancy with the international schools. That's sort of been my life for the last 4 years.
So take me back to the, you said you had sort of a aha moment when you were working with little kids. What was it about them? What was it about that environment that really intrigued you and you said, you know what, this is where I belong?
Yeah. And I've been thinking about this for quite a while, hey, because I think it's always sort of in hindsight that things become more clear. But like I said earlier, I think I must have sensed, you know, that there was something about play that seemed really important. And now I can talk, I think, to quite an extent about how play supports the development of children's cognitive development, emotional development, self-regulation, and so on. But I think I was also kind of drawn to this idea of, like, you know, how engaging play is, and, you know, that you can tell that children are really deeply invested in their learning while they're playing. And I think the other thing that's always really intrigued me is this sense of imagination that is part of play. So particularly, I think in hindsight, I can talk about, you know, what it was that I thought was so interesting about what was happening there. I think in that moment, I kind of sensed it, perhaps, right? Yeah, and I think I've always been really drawn to play also because it is a space where children direct their own learning. And I think I am drawn to settings where, you know, there are these high degrees of, you know, personalized learning going on. I'm not so drawn to spaces where children are told what to do, how to do it, when to do it, with whom to do it. And I think our traditional schooling has never really appealed to me.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I think also there are some sort of misconceptions of play and what sort of play-based learning looks like. And I've heard people say, you know, sort of like a free-for-all, and kids are all over the place. And if you don't sort of know what the aspects of play-based learning are, then it might look sort of chaotic, right? So what would you say to somebody who is new to play-based learning? What is it, and what does it look like?
Yeah, and that's a difficult question actually, because there is also something in the eye of the beholder, hey, like where people might say, "Oh, it looks like chaos," or "It's just play," or "It's so free," and it begs the question, hey, like how free is it really? Hey, if
Mm,
you think about the amount of time that educators have thought about the relationships that they establish with children and children with each other, if they think very deeply about the spaces and the materials, that they think very deeply about the questions and their observations, and then from there think carefully about what can they offer in the space, what kind of question can they ask, what problem can they pose that supports the children with making sense of something. So in general, I would say that there's many different ways that we can look at play. But I've always looked at play really as a space of choice, and that's a really significant part of play is this idea of choice, that children can direct their own learning.
yeah.
So that I think is a significant piece. And then from there, I think that educators really need to think very carefully about the time, the relationships, the interactions, the materials, and spend a lot of time being very invested in that whole cycle of observation, documentation, interpretation, and planning. So early childhood educators, I think, if you come from more instructional models and so on, see play as a break from learning. But if we see it as learning, if we see it as meaning making, as we see it as a space where children direct their own learning, it means that we need to be very invested and very involved in children's play. And that doesn't mean always that we need to play with children or that we constantly need to ask questions, but we're very present while children are playing. Observing, documenting, finding out what's going on, responding to children's questions, sometimes providing a layer of support in another area. So I think teachers really dip into different roles as children are playing. So overall, I'd say it's actually really, really complex.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's something you said in the beginning of that in that response kind of I was thinking about and it was, some people think it's just play, it's only play, and it's kind of downplayed, right? The idea of children playing. And then you mentioned meaning, making meaning, like the children are making their own meaning through this interaction and through this play. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Why do you think there is this sort of downplay of play?
Yeah, and why do we put the word just often in front of what we offer or what we see children do? Hey, as when we talk about very young children, because I hear that all the time. Hey, it's
Yeah,
just play, or they're just exploring the primary colors, or they're just learning how to interact. And I think when you're 3, that is what you're learning, and that is really important. But if I extend on this idea of meaning making a little bit more, I think some researchers would argue that every act of play is an act of inquiry. Okay? So it's this idea that young children, from the moment that they're born, start to interact with the world in this playful manner, okay? Where they're constantly engaging and interacting with both the physical and the social world. Okay? And through these interactions, first of all, their brain is being built. But they also start to make sense of, if I put something in my mouth, what does it feel like? And then I start remembering what this is. Or I try to grasp something and it's a ray of light. I can actually don't put that in my hands, but something else I can hold in my hand. Making sense of language. So children are constantly interacting with the world as a way of building relationships with it, but also to seek meaning and construct meaning. And I think that that's a really beautiful idea. So if you look at the work from Helen Hedges particularly, and she's from New Zealand, she really sort of talks about this idea that children come into our schools with what she calls funds of knowledge. And she says that children continually develop sort of working theories. Hey, that's what she calls them. This is sort of provisional ideas and explanations about how the world works, or who we are, or where we are in time and place, and children think about many things. So it really is our responsibility to dip into, what is it that children already know, understand, and can do? What forms of knowledge do they bring based on their own social cultural context?
Yeah, and then that reminds me of sort of Piaget's idea of cognitive development, right? Where um, kids either they are confronted with some sort of new idea or new knowledge, and they either assimilate it or goes through assimilation or accommodation, and it's those constant experiences that help them understand the world around them.
Yes, it is, and I think it really is. Piaget, I guess, is somebody that we really need to think for what he brought. Need to thank for what he brought to the early childhood realm, and that thinking about cognitive development and so on is this idea that learning really is an active process on behalf of the learner,
Hmm.
right? So that is really something that he has brought to the world. You know, that acknowledgement. But I think what is problematic about Piaget's learning theory is this idea of stages and
Oh
ages and
yeah.
stages.
Mm.
And it has had a really sort of significant impact on early childhood education across the world, I would say. And it seems very pervasive. And a lot of early childhood educators still sort of hold on to this idea of developmentally appropriate. This whole idea of like when you're 3, this is appropriate. When you're 4, this is appropriate. But what we
Right.
know now is that there really is no such thing as a universal child, hey? And that across the world, what children know and understand they can do really depends on their context.
Mm.
Yeah.
So do you think in a way that those developmental stages are useful, maybe if we have a better relationship with them, useful as a tool, not necessarily as a sort of a diagnostic?
Yeah, I have to say that I don't think that they're useful at all. I think what
Mm.
happens is that we really keep children within the parameters of what we think they're capable of. And every
Mhm.
child is so unique that like I think we're now at a point, as far as I understand it, that people are even sort of contesting this whole idea of the linearity in development. Hey, what even Vygotsky does, hey, that we sort of go through this sort of like, yeah, we start here, we go somewhere, hey, and that we think about development in such sort of linear way.
Mhm.
And maybe development is really a sort of agentic space where we go in all kinds of directions, and there is no such thing as linearity.
Yeah,
And
I
maybe
think
it's something that kind of expands, hey, and that it also depends on the learner, the child, of it, like who we are as people, in what direction we push our knowledge, our skills, our understandings, our interests, hey, depending on who we are and where we are.
yeah, that's really interesting because I guess that that becomes a problem also if you're thinking about traditional schools and traditional school settings, where we typically have these little boxes and we try to put our kids in those little boxes. So
Yeah.
what would you suggest for some a school or a teacher that is involved in those sort of traditional settings to um, to be able to start challenging some of those traditional notions of education and learning?
Yeah, and that's a really complicated question, and
Yeah.
not an easy answer, hey? Because you also have to acknowledge that teachers work within national systems where there is this idea of by the end of grade 2, by the end of grade 4, by the end of grade 1, and
Hmm.
so on.
Hmm.
And if that is even legislated by law, there's no two ways about it. You have to work within that frame. But having said that, I think it also starts with our own sense of how do we view the child and how do we view learning. And I think if we deeply, deeply believe that every child is on its own trajectory and that we have to ensure that we meet each child in their zone of proximal development, I think it does shift the way we look at learning, the way we look at learners, and also the way we look at assessment.
Now
That learning is a lot more personalized, and that we need to find ways that we're constantly keeping track of children's learning, and that we also involve children in keeping track of their own learning.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point too, especially with assessment, because I know you talked a little bit earlier about observation and documentation and how important it is for some sort of feedback in the play process as well, so you can let the child know where he is in his learning journey. So what would assessment look like in sort of a play environment?
Yeah, so observation really is your main strategy. Hey?
Hmm.
And then again from there, like thinking about ways that we can do this in systematic ways. And I always encourage teams to think about this in a way that they can manage, if that makes sense. So that also depends on requirements that you may have from your national system and so on. So you have to be systematic in knowing what to look for, because you can't look at everything at the same time. So particularly for people that work in IB schools, I think if you have a particular unit and you've said, this is a unit that really develops the children's ability to think critically, then I would say in the course of that unit, look for critical thinking skills, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can do that with sort of overviews where you write down your anecdotal notes. You can do that per child, you can do that per cohort. There's different ways that you can do it. But I think sometimes targeting some of our anecdotal notes and our observations towards some of those skills that we have identified as important seems a good strategy to me. But having said that, I think we also need to be kind of open for the unexpected, and maybe also that sort of wonder and the beauty of learning. Hey, so being open to those kind of really magical moments that happen, and that we record those. Hey, like a certain discovery or a certain moment when you see a child all of a sudden collaborating with another child for the first time. Hey, so on one hand, I'd like to be systematic. On the other hand, I also want to be open to what's happening around me. But observation really is your key strategy. So that is a huge part of the teacher and play-based learning, I think.
Okay.
Making sure that there are ways that we observe children and that we document that information, because there's otherwise so much that gets lost.
Yeah, and so sticking with the idea of assessment, where do you think the idea of sort of self-assessment and child input comes into the equation of assessment?
Yeah, no, like that, of course, is a really significant piece, hey? Like, particularly if you think about ways that, like, if you're really good at keeping track of your own learning, thinking about the goals, perhaps success criteria, and so on, it helps you to, over time, become a learner who can self-adjust.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, because you can kind of keep your eye on, okay, these are the success criteria. This is what I already can do. This is what I can't do yet. And then you become more agentic in your learning process. Of course, with very young children, I think we're still very focused on the development of those skills. Hey, because in order to become self-regulated, children also need to develop their meta-cognitive thinking skills. They need to have expand their vocabulary. They have to expand their ability to focus, to work with multiple ideas in mind, to persevere. So in my mind, like in the early years, you really develop that sort of key set of skills.
Mm-hmm.
But having said that, like also already in the early years, sometimes you can ask children about, like, how do you think about your own thinking? And what have you been thinking about today? And what have you learned? And what is it that you don't know yet? And what can we do to support you with your thinking? These are all questions, I think, that help children to think about their thinking.
Yeah.
But it's kind of building those reflection moments and weave them sort of build those moments in throughout the day, sort of weave them throughout the day. Hey, so that doesn't become this big reflection moment. You do maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then there's something else.
Right. So that kind of makes me think about, you're talking about self-regulation and children having to sort of develop that self-regulation and some of those skills that are really needed to kind of learn with the people around them, right? And that brings me to the idea of agency. And so I think that's another sort of buzzword that gets floated around a lot, with a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings surrounding agency. So could you talk a little bit about what agency is and what it would look like in that school setting?
Yeah, so there is this notion of agency, and then within a school setting, I think we're more prone, I guess the word is, to talk about learner agency here. And of course, those two, the ideas are interconnected. So maybe the way I can explain this is to talk about my own ever-evolving understanding of agency. How does that sound?
Yeah, perfect.
So I think for me, agency has always been linked to this idea of the child as an active meaning maker, and this child that wants to be in relationship with the world. Hey, so and that the child also directs his or her own learning through the interactions, preferences, ideas, and the child's own identity, so to say, that pushes him or her in a certain direction. So that was sort of my early understanding of agency. Perhaps coming from, the beautiful work that's done in Reggio Emilia, where they have been thinking so much about how they view the child, and they talk about this idea of the agentic child. So that was sort of my early understanding of agency. But as my understanding of agency has expanded over time, and thinking about what agency looks like in schools, I think it really is about learners that seek the conditions in their learning that they're after, if that makes sense. So it's this idea that you're not sort of passively experiencing things, but that you're an active co-constructor and participant in your life and the lives of others. And I think this maybe takes me to this idea of like misconceptions around agency. I think a lot of people kind of think about agency as something that only sits in the learner or in the student. But agency really lives at the intersection of the child's agency, but also the agency of other children and the agency of the adults. So it's kind of my agency delimited by yours, but delimited by yours. And I actually think that that's a really beautiful idea. Okay, so because if you kind of expand on this, then you kind of get to this idea that agency is also about citizenship. Okay? And also about how do I participate in my school, or in the IB word, say, how do I participate in my learning community, and how do I contribute, and how do I seek conditions that I'm after, not only perhaps in school, but also in the world. Okay? How do I take action? But particularly, I think learner agency speaks to the degrees in which learners can make decisions about their learning. With whom do I learn? How do I learn? How do I express what I have learned? Where do I go next? How can I adjust my learning so that I reach my learning goals? How do I reflect on my learning? And so it speaks, high degrees of ownership, I'd say. It involves choice. And I guess, one of the reasons why I'm really passionate about learner agency is, I think, because it has the potential to really change the identity of schools. Because you can go down the realm of highly personalized learning, but you don't have to. It can also really be about ensuring that we provide choice, that we listen to children's perspectives, that we're more honed into or tuned into the questions that they ask, ways the things that they're wondering about, so that there is more, we ensure that there are multiple opportunities for children to voice their opinions, their ideas, their preferences, and so on. Because I think for such a long time, learning has been done to students, but what we want is, that they really understand that learning is something that they have to do themselves. Right?
Yeah.
And you have to do it for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and that's really where you want to take them, right? To be lifelong learners. And so, what's interesting to me is that agency is such a profound thing, right? That it goes beyond the school, it goes beyond the school walls, and you want to teach these students how to, again, be lifelong learners and be productive, as you said, productive citizens in their society, in their communities, and agency is a big part of that. So, what would you say the school's role is to develop sort of that agency in the students? Are we still there?
Hi, I think I lost you for a minute. Do you want to repeat that last question?
8:51. Let me write down the time here so I can go ahead and edit that out. Sorry about that.
No.
What I was saying is that it seems like agency is a big, broader, and sort of profound idea, right? And what we want to do is prepare our students to be, as you said, productive citizens in their society, productive citizens in their community, and the school has a big role in developing that agency in the students so that they can go out and be those productive citizens. What would you say the school's role is in developing that idea of agency in our students? Because it can't necessarily, I think a lot of times schools take on a bigger role than they're prepared or they're equipped to take on. And I think sometimes they lose their identity because of that. They're trying to take on too much. But this, I think, is something that schools can really be a part of, is developing that agency in those individual students so that they understand their responsibilities as productive citizens. So what do you think? What would you say the role of the school is in developing that sense of agency?
Yeah, like I often think about like agency as something that will sort of sip into many dimensions of learning and teaching and the learning community. So there's not like an immediate sort of straightforward answer.
Yeah.
Um, but I would say, first of all, that I think agency is also about ensuring that we involve children in the decisions that affect them. And I think that in itself is a really interesting idea. It's one of the rights of the child. But do we really do this? So do we have conversations with students about what the schedule looks like, what their rooms look like, the kind of games that we play together, perhaps the rules that we have and so on. So if we really start to think about this idea of consulting children in decisions that affect them, that actually entails quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, like, and even working on this as a team might be an interesting starting point. Because that also means that we need to listen. It means that we need to compromise. It maybe means that we need to set up sort of weekly opportunities for groups of children to come together to kind of talk about, how has the week been? How are we learning together and so on? Is there anything on the agenda? Is there everything we need to think about?
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes a lot more democratic space. I've also seen a lot of schools that involve, think about this idea of involving children in decisions that affect them by installing some sort of student council that is involved in, and that teachers seek these children's perspectives when big decisions need to be made. And vice versa, okay? So that children also make proposals to teachers and say, hey, how do you think about this? So the other day I was at this school in Switzerland where the student council actually wrote to the teachers council and said, we want to change the playground rules. And I thought that's just delightful. So the children really wanted to play with their peers and brothers and sisters and so on. So wanted to move away from this idea that the rules were very much about preschool and kindergarten play at one part of the playground, and then grade 1 and 2 could be at one part only, and they couldn't expand beyond that space. And the children wanted to change those rules, and of course the teachers were a little bit like, ooh, it made them it created some tension within the team. And I think that that's an interesting way of thinking about agency. Is like, okay, we need to listen, but we have a perspective too, and how can we work this through?
Right.
And so I think as teachers start to engage with this idea of agency, maybe we could start there. Hey, we're thinking very much about the rights of the child, hey, the right of the child to autonomy, the right of the child to independence, the right of the child to be consulted in decisions that affect them, and what are ways that we can listen to children, compromise and work things through, and create that sort of learning environment that really is based on shared decision making, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Where we create that space where my agency is delimited by yours, and so on. Hey, instead of us making all those decisions, maybe this is a good starting point for people, because I think we've often never really thought about that, right? Like, and I did it too. I organized the parties. I decided what cupcakes.
Right.
I decided where we would be going on a field trip. I would set up the classroom. I decided what the schedule looked like. It was all about what I decided. So maybe moving away from I to we.
And why do you think that is? Because I know, personally speaking, I know sometimes I step in, and sometimes, step into situations where I probably shouldn't. I should let the kids figure it out. But it's almost because it's more efficient that way, and everything, and we're very pressed for time. And if I just sat back and let it happen, the child might learn more from that experience, but we got to go. We got to go. We got to go to the next thing. So
Yeah.
do you think that in itself, those sort of strict schedules and guidelines and always sort of being rushed to go to the next thing interferes with that learning process?
I think so. It's also about like what do we give value to, right? Because we can't negotiate all the time, and I know that. But I guess I do have a feeling that we're often in these sort of pressurized environments, hey, where there's one thing after another and so on. And we live those kind of lives, and I always wonder what it does to us, right?
Yeah.
I was listening to one head of primary. So what he does is sort of every 4 weeks, he spends a day in a classroom with children, and then he does what children do. And it's really interesting, I think, to listen to his reflections. And he said, I was really tired at the end of the day, and sometimes I just wanted to be alone, and I really needed that time to be outside, and that I could decide what I could do. And I think it is because we set up a class schools where there is just so much going on, and why? Hey, so I think the moment we start listening and responding and creating a context where we're figuring out things together, it'd be interesting to see the children's perspectives of how they view the schedule, how they perceive time. Yeah, so I think time is another piece. You know, what kind of relationships do we build with children? Um, And I think from there, like maybe then we can start thinking about ways that we can personalize learning in ways that increasingly supports learners with making choices.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
and
and
it,
that will look different in every school, and
mhm.
that is a huge process, hey? Because if you start thinking about the realms of personalized learning, then you can rethink space. There's a lot to think about, hey? How do we organize this? Can we even step away from not only the barriers of the grade level, but even beyond, right? Like there is just a lot to think about when you go into the realms of personalized learning, but it's exciting. I also think when we do this that we still need to ensure that there are moments where we ensure that learners are co-constructing meaning and that learning still is a social process, eh? So that
Mhm.
we don't end up in the realms of individualized learning. So it's a huge challenge. So for people that are interested in this idea, there is a school in Australia. They're called Rurana Park, I think. And
Mhm.
if you Google them and on YouTube, there's interesting movies of how they have personalized learning. Lots of ideas and people talking about this. So that might be, for those who are interested, something to pursue.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be interested in seeing some of the ideas as well, because, like you said, it is complex. It is difficult to do, and I know coming from the U.S. system, where again everything is sort of in boxes, right? And we try to put our kids in these boxes and say you have to do this at this time, this at this time, and we don't give them the chance to kind of explore and learn on their own. And as early as kindergarten, they start taking standardized tests and they start standardizing the children and standardizing the learning. And I
Yeah.
think that is to the detriment of the child's learning because they learn. And this is something that when I talked to Dr. Peter Gray um, on the podcast, he was saying that kids learn how to play school really well,
Yeah.
and it's not necessarily that they're learning, but they're learning how to adapt to that environment. And it's interesting because you don't necessarily want them to adapt to that sort of rigid environment. You want them to adapt to a more fluid environment, which is what the world is, right? But we're not
Yeah.
giving them the chance to do that. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to me that the efforts that we're putting in, thinking that we're doing the child good, is actually doing them harm.
Yeah. And I know that everything that educators do is always with the best of intentions, right? Like,
Right, exactly.
yeah, yeah. And I also think what happens is that we kind of reproduce the models of our own childhood. Hey, like if I think we become experts of school because we're being schooled.
Yeah.
We go
Yeah.
to school school. And then we reproduce those models because that's what we know. And yes, the world has changed so dramatically that I think our schools need to change too. But this is where it gets tricky, because somehow we want to, and parents often, and politicians, they kind of want to reproduce old models and put a lot of emphasis on this idea of accountability. We need to test things and so on. So I think for a long time there's been this push for this idea that learning is controllable, that everything can be measured. But if
Yeah.
you think about it, the things that really matter can't really be measured. Okay? And that is, I think, a conversation that we need to have with politicians, with key change makers, with parents, with each other. It's like, what is the role of school today, right? And why do children actually really go to school?
Yeah.
And this whole idea that it really, in the end, of course, knowledge is important. It is important that children have some deeper conceptual understandings. They need to acquire a certain set of skills, particularly with regards to literacy and numeracy, and all of that is important. But in the end, it is skills like communication, social skills, your self-management skills, your ability to think critically and creatively, your research skills. Those are the things that are really setting you up for success in life, don't you think? Those key set of skills and dispositions that make you a person who's happy, a person who collaborates well with others, a person who knows him or herself as a learner, that the things that you're passionate about and so on, and that you want to participate in your community. Isn't that what it's all about?
Yeah,
So to
absolutely.
me, creating a school that supports the development of those key skills, that I think is where this notion of agency comes into the frame again. Because in some ways I don't think school is preparation for life. It is life. And if
Mm.
we create a context where children are decision makers, that they have autonomy, that they are co-constructors of the learning environment and so on, I think from the moment that they enter our schools, they know what it's like to matter and to be part of something. And I think if we experience that in school, I would argue that we would be more inclined to do that in our societies. But that's my hunch, so to say.
No, yeah, absolutely, and it definitely it definitely lends itself to that, right? So if your school is more democratic, if it is more uh, um, compassionate, then odds are that when you get out of school, you'll be prepared to be more democratic and compassionate yourself.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I totally agree. I think that that is a great role of a school, and to be a part of that community, and then producing people in that community that will care about the people in their community and beyond. I
Yeah.
mean, that's that seems like a good role of a school, right?
Yeah, and places where we share culture, right?
and I,
That
and I wonder if because I know in the U.S. Uh, you take the standardized test, X amount of people, X amount of your students pass, you get a certain category in this system, right? And the state sends you a big banner and you hang it up and it says, "We are exemplary. We're an exemplary school because 90% of our students pass the test," or whatever that might be, right? And it's all predicated. The success is measured on the success on that one particular standardized test. And so that school is good if they pass the test and they have a banner hanging. But what happens is that, and I've seen it firsthand, is that these students and the ones who need it the most, all of a sudden aren't allowed to go outside and play, aren't allowed to go and sort of waste time in quotations, right? They're made to sit in desks for longer periods of time to pass that particular standardized test, and it's I feel it's killing their curiosity, their imagination, their will to learn, because now all of a sudden learning is supposed to be fun and addicting and natural, and it becomes the opposite. It becomes unnatural, it becomes cold, it becomes unpersonalized, and They don't want to do it anymore. And then they get to middle school, and then they get to high school, and they end up dropping out. And we wonder why, right?
Yeah, I know.
But it seems like this is so counterproductive and almost so obvious that kids need to be kids, and we're not allowing them to.
Yeah, yeah, and then I think, and that teachers need to be teachers, right? And we're not allowing them to do that either. Like you say,
Yeah,
I'm not surprised that teachers drop out of the profession. Eh? If you look at the numbers in the US, I'm not surprised, because why would you do that? Well,
yeah,
and the pressure, no, but like I understand it. Like there's these huge pressures of preparing children for the test, and that you're accountable for that, and that the results of the tests, the testing, yeah, banners, it's on the website, so it determines whether you're a good teacher or not. So
yeah,
you're under a lot of duress. And yeah, a lot of time goes to preparing rather than teaching. Yeah.
yeah.
Uh,
That's a big part of it. Test prep is
yeah,
huge.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so, what kind of message does that send to children about learning, to teachers about learning and teaching? And I do think that we need to be very thoughtful about ways that we keep track of children's learning, ways that we document, and also that there are moments where we do this point in time measurement, so that we know where children are at. You know, that is part of our assessment practices, of being an assessment literate teacher. That matters. It doesn't mean that we need to step into this, pervasive, what's the word, this testing culture. Like, it doesn't
Mhm.
have to be like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it seems like the pendulum swings a little bit too far in the testing end and data-driven aspect of schools
yeah,
nowadays.
yeah, yeah. And there's this quote, I'm not exactly sure who said it, but something about not everything that matters can be measured, and not everything that is measured, matters. And I think that that's actually quite true.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I read
the
that the
emphasis
other
is
day.
so much. Yeah, yeah,
Was that Einstein? I want to say that was Einstein.
yeah. Perhaps it was. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I'd like, he's clever. It
he's a
must have been
smart guy.
Einstein.
He's a smart guy that didn't do very well in the standard traditional school system either, right?
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. But yeah, so like, because I think particularly with the skills that described earlier, those are ones that are hard to measure, but it doesn't
Mm,
mean that they're not important.
mm,
Yeah, yeah,
absolutely. So, what do you think? Because I am a kindergarten teacher, kindergarten physical education teacher, I should say. Right now, in my current position in the States, I worked 12 years in Houston, Texas, as a early childhood, so pre-K through fifth grade physical education teacher, and I absolutely love what I do. It's fantastic. I think movement is a huge part of the learning process, and I love watching and being able to watch my kids enjoy themselves through movement. Um, now, this my class is 45 minutes long, and so we have a very short time to expose the children to new experiences, expose them to experiences that they might enjoy and might want to do again and replicate. Um, but like I said, it's a short time, and in that time, I want them to also develop this idea of agency in 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 the realm of movement. So, what kind of advice would you give a physical education teacher of how they can incorporate those kinds of ideas, those kinds of concepts in physical education with a limited amount of time as well?
yeah. And I feel a little sort of conflicted answering your question, because part of me thinks about this idea that, there is some research that says that children actually move more when they're on the playground playing than they would be in a phys ed class. Right?
Uh-huh, yeah.
So part of me is still kind of pulled towards this idea that, like, children need ample time, uninterrupted time for play in both indoor and outdoor learning spaces. So I think that that's an important thing to say. I also think that over time, as children's ability to self-regulate increases, that we can start thinking about introducing people like yourself, like that bring a certain expertise But again, what is the right time to do this? I step into a lot of schools, particularly international schools, where we have access to wonderful people like you that have this expertise, where 3-year-olds, from the moment that they step into school, all of a sudden need to go to a PE lesson. And the question is that really the right choice for those children at that point in time?
Mm.
So again, hey, this whole idea of when do we introduce those specialist teachers? How do children build a relationship with these people? And then maybe at some point start building a relationship with a space that is geared towards movement, hey, or towards art, or towards music, or whatever. So that was a long introduction before I started thinking about your question.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a short amount of time, and I can see that you want to expose children to a certain set of skills or ideas of how to move and so on. So if we bring this idea of voice and choice and ownership into the picture here, I would say that first of all, we start thinking about ways that we build relationship with children, and then we didn't start listening to what are the games that they like to play, for example? Hey, like because every group of children will have a couple of games that they prefer. Hey, the things that really resonate with a certain group.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was one way of listening. And I think also if we start, for example, working on a unit where it is about throwing and catching, hey, different ways to interact with balls or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like that you create these different stations that maybe children can choose where they want to go. Okay? And again, maybe first there is this idea of choice, and then maybe at some point you may for 10 or 15 minutes say, okay, but now we're going to rotate through these different stations to ensure that everybody has at least tried it once.
Yeah.
And I can also imagine that as you start looking at the way that children interact with these different stations, that you might see that there's a particular one that they're interested in. And you may decide to keep that station there when you start introducing a new unit that is more moved towards jumping and landing or whatever it is, that you leave that one station in the space so that children can return to this if they want to. So
Mm-hmm.
I think what I'm trying to say is that, like, through the responses and the things that children show you, I think they're telling you what their preferences are, what they're interested in.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something that I've been doing a lot of lately is sort of surveying the kids and seeing what their interest is and what they enjoy, and then adding aspects of those things that they enjoy into the lesson. Just like you said, like with stations, we have this board where we have these little magnets where the students have their pictures on the magnets, and I asked them, what station was your favorite? What station did you enjoy the most? A question like that, and they would put their magnets on on the station that they enjoyed the most, and then I can take a picture of that, and I can have that as a reference point. And then we would keep 2 of those stations, and then 2 would be new experiences, right? And so what I've noticed is that the stations last for at the most 2 meetings, and then the 3rd meeting it gets a little crazy at those stations. So sometimes we have to sometimes we have to change it up a little bit to keep it, to keep the novelty of the station a little bit.
Yeah,
But
to
yeah,
keep it
that's
interesting.
that's definitely something that I've been thinking a lot about in how to incorporate some of that choice and voice within, like I said, that time frame and that limited time that I see them as well. And I think another thing that you said is really important that I kind of rushed, I think, a little bit in the beginning of the year, which is relationships, and how they're developing this relationship with this teacher that they've never seen before, and it's almost like a forced relationship because now I'm dropping you off in this guy's gym, and there you go, right? Go for it. Dropping you off, and now it's your class. Um, and I think I went in the beginning of the year into skill development, into my idea of what PE should be too early before I developed those relationships with the kids. So would you say somebody in my position, somebody a physical education teacher again, that may only see their kids twice a week, maybe even once a week, spend a majority of that first portion of the school year just simply developing the relationships and getting to know their students and who they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and see where their physical abilities lie. Hey, and I the other day met this really clever PE teacher who the first couple of weeks he goes with them to the playground and
Yeah.
observes them there. Like, and isn't that a wonderful way to build a relationship with these young learners? Eh? Into the space that might provoke more jumping, climbing, running, or whatever you'd like to see. And maybe different things at different points in time, so that you can build that picture of who the child is and what their interests and their strengths are, maybe some areas for next steps and so on, but that you also build that relationship with the children in a familiar space before at some point you say, hey, there's another space in the school where we can, that is set up for movement. Let's go have a look. What is here? That could be a whole inquiry in itself, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I know you talked a little bit about the Reggio Emilia, and I know they're big on using the environment as another learning tool, right? So I think it's like the adults in the child's life, the peers of the child's life, and then the environment around them. And I think another thing that for me personally, when kind of reflecting on my year, is that I didn't use my environment to its potential. So I have this big, huge gym, right? And and when the students come in, it's almost overwhelming because it's loud, it's echoey, it's this enormous space, and I didn't think about it. I didn't think about it in the way that a 5-year-old walking into this enormous space would think about it. And I think that's another thing that's really important that you had mentioned before, is seeing this space and seeing these experiences through the eyes of a 5-year-old and putting yourself in that position.
Yeah, and step into the space maybe on your knees. Hey, if you can do that, or go on your knees to
No,
see,
absolutely.
what are the children encountering? What's on their level?
Mm-hmm.
And how can we ensure that they are still in the space even when they're not there? Hey, so I was also thinking about this idea of agency, of how wonderful it would be if there is images of these children while they're throwing and catching, or while they're playing a game, so that they are represented in the space. And perhaps a kind of a memory of, how do I catch, or how do I throw, or what does that look like, or how do I jump off this high thing? And there's a sort of a memory of, oh yeah, this is the way to do it. Hey, even like a little iPad that's there with the station, so you can go back to an example of somebody who jumps and lands on 2 feet. I
Mm-hmm.
think this whole idea of documentation as part of the space is interesting. Because it kind of helps you to kind of revisit your learning, if that makes sense. So the documentation can also be in the space. And I know you have multiple students who come through that space all the time, but then particularly the use of iPads, or a small like snippet of a movie or something you show them at the beginning, might be a way for children to reconnect with previous experiences in the space.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that idea. I'm definitely gonna look into being able to do more of that, because I know I use them to help and to help explain things and as examples and things like that. It helped me out in that respect. And another thing that we did that I think came out pretty well was we had the students trace each other on paper, and they were expressing themselves. We were talking about how we express ourselves, and they were expressing themselves in a joyful way. And so they posed on this sort of paper, and they outlined themselves. And then my assistant and I cut those papers out, cut these big, huge papers of them out, and then we hung them all over the gym. And so in the gym, there's all these expressions of the children expressing themselves joyfully, and it's great. I love it. I love seeing it. And the kids, when they come in, and the first time they came in, they were super excited. But even to this day, we've had them up for months, for a couple months probably, well, probably like 3 months. And even to this day, the kids will come in and say, "Look, that's me. that cutout, that's mine, that's me. And they know, and they can identify themselves, and it makes them so happy to see their expression up on the wall and to be able to reference that. I think it's great. I think it's very powerful, for the kids to be able to see uh, their expression with the rest of the class's joyful expressions as well.
Yeah, it sounds really lovely. And I can imagine that it is an important reference point for the children there in this space. It's something I made that represents me. I'm part of
Mm.
this somehow. So I think the children are trying, they're really telling you something that is really important, eh? And something to remember for next year, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah,
That,
absolutely. And so that's definitely something that I have on my list of things to do in reflection of this year, and definitely something that I will start off the next year trying to do more of, because I think it's really
yeah.
important.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess the other thing for me is, hey, if you think about this idea of agency, is also that children have easy access to a range of open-ended materials. So that,
Mm.
like, if you think about autonomy, independence, but also self-regulation, can the children tidy up their own balls? Can they put things away and so on?
Yeah.
And investing the time in these kind of routines so that, yeah, children know how to be part of the space and take care of it.
Yeah, and that also adds to their sense of contribution too, right?
Yeah.
If they're part of the like you said, the tidying up of and the maintaining of the space, I think that's really important too.
Yeah.
So I know we're getting close to the end of the hour. So thank you so much for joining us, first of all. And I definitely want to leave you with the last word. So if you have any message that you would like to leave our listeners, please feel free to do that. And if somebody wanted to ask you a question, or if they wanted to continue the conversation, if they wanted to uh, maybe reach out to you about a question that they might have, what's the best way they could reach you?
Probably either Twitter or Facebook. So find
Okay.
me on Twitter or Facebook. So I have my own Facebook page, or the Learning Square, which is my consultancy company. That would probably be a good place to find me. I'm quite active on social media. I've also recently started a blog with Fiona Zinn called Constant Conversations. So what Fiona and I wanted to do was really sort of have a conversation with each other about the things that we write about. Hey, so we sort of like a new idea for a blog is where we're constantly responding to each other with our blog entries.
Okay.
So it's called Constant Conversation. So that might be another place where people may want to look, read what we've written, and respond perhaps. And yeah, gosh, a piece of advice. That's a really tricky question. Now I feel pressurized to see something really poignant at the end of this really lovely interview. I really loved chatting with you too. Um, yeah, and is it about agency? Is it about play? You know what to say, hey? But maybe the last thing I want to say is really about that. I think this idea of agency really invites us to think very deeply about the beliefs that we hold about children, and that, like, and this really comes from Reggio, is that everything that we say or do, and now I'm quoting Jen Malikan, everything we say or do goes back to our image of the child, what we believe about children, who their rights are, what their responsibilities are, and so on. So that, I think, is linked to that whole conversation about listening, honoring the child as a holder of rights, and so on. So I think my last advice would be to think very deeply about your own image of who the child is, and talk with other educators about who they think children are. And that really is very, very complex, because I think it's so easy for us to say, oh, yes, I believe that children are competent. And yet, on a daily basis, and myself included, we make decisions, say things, do things that kind of negate this idea of the competent child.
Yeah.
And it goes into many things. Hey, we decide what children eat. We decide where they sit when they go for lunch. We decide what goes on their plate. We make decisions. It's just everywhere. Okay? We don't really listen, or we assume that something is too dangerous, right? It's everywhere. So that's my piece of advice, I think, for everyone.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a great night.
Thank you. You too.